In our continuing studies of the letter to the Romans, we come now to the end of the preface to the letter. Paul writes the preface, and it comprises chapter 1, verses 1 through 16. And we come to the last 3 verses of that preface today, and I want to read them for you. This is what we'll be studying today. I am debtor both to the Greeks and to the barbarians, both to the wise and to the unwise. So as much as in me is, I am ready to preach the gospel to you that are in Rome also. For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation to everyone that believeth, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. Now, we should review what we've done so far in this preface. This preface, verses 1 through 16, is filled with doctrine and filled with autobiographical statements about St. Paul. And we should just review it quickly. In the first verse, you remember, Paul told us that he was a slave to Jesus Christ, that he was called as an apostle, that he was set apart for the gospel of God. And then in verses 2 through 6, he tells us what this gospel of God is, the subject matter of what he'll be preaching and what he'll be talking about in the letter to the Romans. And that's in verses 2 through 6. He says it's a gospel that has been already preached in the Old Testament. It's a gospel that's centered in Jesus Christ, and so on and so forth. Then he comes to verses 7 and 8. And here Paul tells the Roman Christians what God has done for them, that God has loved them, that God has called them into his family, that God has given them grace and peace and so forth. Then in verse 8, he tells them, he mentions how impressed he is with the faith of the Roman Christians, that their faith has been so illustrious that it's gone throughout the whole world, and the other churches have learned about it and learned about the great faith of these Roman Christians, these Roman believers. And then in verses 9 through 13, we learn about Paul and his great ministry, and we learn about Paul's pastoral heart. He sees himself as already a pastor to these people in Rome whom he's never met, and he wants to go to them, he wants to visit them, wants to pray for them, is praying for them, wants to give them some spiritual gift that their faith might be established, and so forth. And he wants very much to visit them and see them, and he's trying to do that. So that's what we see. Now, today, we come to the last 3 verses of this preface. And here, Paul, in these 3 verses, 14, 15, and 16 of chapter 1, Paul is really a model evangelist to us. He's telling us what his life is as an evangelist. And he makes 3 statements about himself in these verses, respective to each of these verses. And in verse 14, he says, I am debtor. Then in verse 15, he says, I am eager. Then in verse 16, he says, I am not ashamed. In each case, he's talking about his relationship to the gospel. He's a debtor to those to whom he's to preach the gospel. He's eager to preach the gospel. He's not ashamed of the gospel of Christ. This is Paul the evangelist, really Paul the model evangelist for us, because all that he is and all that he does is an example to us. We can follow him as we share our faith, and we can have the same attitudes and obligation that he has as he tells his faith, as he wants to preach it to these Roman Christians. We can have the same type of attitude and obligation and eagerness and unashamed attitude as we go out and minister and give this gospel to other people. So let's look at these 3 verses together. First, he says in verse 13, he says, I am debtor. I am debtor. Verse 14, I am debtor, both to the Greeks and to the barbarians, both to the wise and to the unwise. What is this great verse telling us? Well, first of all, it's telling us that he has this sense of obligation on him, this sense of constraint, this sense of that he's been entrusted with the gospel, and he must give it to others. Now, what is the debt? What is the kind of debt that he has, that he refers to? Well, there's two kinds of debt. There's the kind of debt we have. If someone gives us $100, we owe that person back the $100. There's another kind of debt, though, that if a person gives us $100 for someone else, that we are to give to someone else, then we are in debt to that third party to give to them that $100. We are in debt to them. We are kind of the middleman. We've been given this $100. We're to give it to these other people. That puts us in debt to these other people. And that's Paul, the apostle. He has been given this gospel. He's been entrusted with it. He's been saved himself personally. And so he is to give this gospel to the Greeks and the barbarians, wise and unwise. He has this sense of obligation on him. See, and that's the debt that he is in. He has this sense of obligation to give this gospel out. Now, the question is for us, do we have that sense of obligation? Do we have any sense of constraint and obligation to get that gospel out, to tell others about our faith? Or are we ashamed of the gospel, as Paul mentions later? We are to get that gospel out and have the same dedication and sense of obligation that Paul does. Do we have that? Do we have that sense of obligation within us? Or do we think, well, we've been saved, God has redeemed us and brought us into his family, and that's the end of it. We're happy and we're assured, and that's all there is to it. No, we're to give that faith to others. We're to share it with others. Well, the other thing about his being a debtor to the Greeks and the barbarians, we might ask, who is he a debtor to? And he is both a debtor to the Greeks, the literate, philosophical, cultured people, and the barbarians, or the non-Greeks. And from the Greeks' perspective, the uncultured, the illiterate, the people that are not learned. And that's how Paul is seeing the world. He's seeing the world divided between Greeks and non-Greeks, or Greeks and barbarians. The Greeks heard the barbarians using their language, and it sounded like they were saying bar, and so the Greeks called them barbarians. But the interesting thing is that the Jews are included within that barbarian category. And so Paul is saying he is a debtor. He is a debtor both to the literate and to the uneducated. And this is very interesting, because he's not saying that he has to prepare himself to speak to the intellectual or to the cultured or to the educated. He was, in fact, prepared in his own intellectual education to speak to the intellectually minded and the educated. But he's giving the same gospel to the educated and to the non-educated. It's the same gospel. It's the same gospel that he gives to both, because that same plain and simple gospel can save both those kinds of people, the educated and the non-educated. We're not to feel that we have to be trained in intellectual things to give the plain and simple gospel to the cultured and the educated. And we're not to believe that we are to be specially educated to give it to the uneducated. No, we give the same gospel to both people, and both people. It is the power unto salvation to everyone that believes. So we have to remember that. Paul was a debtor to all these kinds of people, the unwise and the wise. He was a debtor to both them, to all of them. And he had this sense of obligation to get this gospel to all these kinds of people. And the same gospel can save anybody. The same gospel, plainly described and plainly preached or witnessed, can save anybody wherever they are. The interesting thing is that when you when you witness the gospel to someone, you have this sense of obligation on you, like Paul, and you witness the gospel to someone. You tell them about your Christian life. You tell them how God's grace has brought you into God's family, and so forth, by the cross of Christ. You tell them this gospel, and you may never see the fruit of that witnessing to them. You may never see the sprouting of the seed that you have planted with that person, but you have planted the seed, because the gospel is the power unto salvation to everyone who believes. That seed has been planted there. To change the metaphor, we might say you have planted the hook in that person's consciousness. And years later, maybe, the Lord will begin to pull on that line and pull that person closer and closer to salvation. And that great battle will begin between that person's heart and God's will. But God will keep pulling that line, hopefully, and that person will come in to the kingdom of God. You will never see that. You will never see that consequence of your planting that hook. But the gospel is the power unto salvation. And you have to see that it has that power. And when you witness, it will plant the hook. Make no mistake about that, I guarantee it. The Bible is guaranteeing it. All right, well, that's the first thing Paul says. He says, I am debtor both to the Greeks and the barbarians. And then he says, I am eager. In the next verse, verse 15, he says, I am eager to preach the gospel to you who are there at Rome. I'm eager to preach the gospel. Well, here Paul shows himself to be ready, to be always ready when God calls him to preach the gospel or to witness it to anybody. He's ready. He's ready and he's prepared. He's prepared. And can we be prepared? Yes, we can be prepared with a knowledge of the scriptures, maybe memorization of certain verses of the scriptures that we would share with someone. We can be prepared. We can be prepared in prayer, ready to go the instant we perceive that God in his providence has brought a certain person across our path, and we can talk to them about the faith. This is evangelism. This is what Paul is doing, and this is what we can do. And he was eager to do this. He was ready to do this whenever the Lord called him to do this, or whenever someone intersected his path, he could talk to them about the Lord. And this is what he did. And we should be eager too. We should be eager. We should be ready. You know, the Lord says we're ready. When we're Christians, we're ready with the gifts of the Spirit. God has given us gifts of the Spirit to minister, to witness. And so we have the gifts of the Spirit to make us ready. We have also the armor of God to make us ready, to defend against the wiles of the devil. We have all the armor of God to be a valiant warrior, taking the gospel of Christ to others. And we can do this. And this is how we can be ready, like Paul was ready to preach the gospel to those who were in Rome, those believers in Rome. Now we come to the last verse, verse 16. And really, this is the most important verse, I think, because here Paul says he is not ashamed. Listen to this, verse 16. For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation to every one that believeth, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. I want to ask you today, are you embarrassed about the gospel of Christ? Are you embarrassed to share your faith with others? Do you have a little sense and twinge of embarrassment when someone knows that you went to church on Sunday? Sometimes we have this, and this is quite natural, because, you know, the old man in us is dying, but he's still there somewhat. And the new man is there, dominant, to take over, Paul says, but the old man takes some time sometimes to completely die away. And we might feel ashamed at times when we share the gospel, or when people find out that we're a Christian. We might have a twinge of shame. This is something that we have to work on. We have to come to that place where, like Paul, we are not ashamed of the gospel. We can't be ashamed of the gospel. Timothy was ashamed, and Paul knew it. Timothy was a little ashamed of the gospel, we believe, because Paul had to write these things to him. It says in 2 Timothy 1:12, I am not ashamed, for I know whom I have believed. And in 2 Timothy 2:15, he says, study to show thyself approved unto God, a workman that needeth not be ashamed. And then he says in Philippians concerning himself, in nothing shall I be ashamed as I preach the gospel. This is something that he was sensitive to Timothy about. He wanted to encourage Timothy not to be ashamed of the gospel. Well, why was Paul not ashamed? We have to ask this question. Why was he not ashamed? Well, first of all, because it was a gospel unto salvation. He was not ashamed because this gospel could save souls. This gospel could save a person and redeem a person from hell. That's why he wasn't ashamed. He was not ashamed because he knew that when he preached this gospel, there was a possibility of someone becoming a Christian. This gospel was the power of God unto salvation. It, in and of itself, it had this power, and it could change a person's life and bring him into the family of God and redeem him. So Paul was not ashamed of this gospel because he knew its power. He knew what it could do in the life of a person. He was not ashamed also because the very preaching and witnessing of the gospel is, here it says, is the power of God. The gospel itself is called the power of God unto or leading to salvation. The Greek word eis there means leading to or intending to salvation. So the idea is that the witnessing of the gospel is itself the power of God to bring that person in. If it's met with faith in that listener, it brings that person into the kingdom of God. It is the power itself. So the gospel is not a statement about God or about something. The gospel is not something that's teaching us about something else. The gospel itself is the power to save a soul. The gospel is that power. Now, this isn't magic, but it's not mechanical, but it's very important that you see the gospel is that power of God unto salvation. So when you witness the gospel, it is God witnessing the gospel to that person. When you witness the gospel, or as a pastor, when you preach the gospel, it is God's voice that is coming through your preaching. For the gospel is the power of God unto salvation. That's why Paul is not embarrassed or timid with it. He knows that it's God's power. He knows that it's God's instrument for salvation. So here we have Paul, the model evangelist, and we are called to be like him. We are called to have a sense of obligation on us to witness to others. We are called to be eager and ready to witness that wonderful faith that God has given us personally and touched us with. And we are not to be ashamed of the gospel because of what it can do and its power, what it can do in the life of another person. This is Paul, the model evangelist, and we must have these attitudes and this obligation, this eagerness, and this lack of shame in the gospel. We must be the same as St. Paul, the model evangelist that he was. Please subscribe to my channel, will you? And also note there that you can give a comment. Leave me a comment of what you think about these sessions and if you have questions and so forth. I would really appreciate it. And we'll see you next time.